Hi, this is David. Welcome to Part 1, Topic 4, Valuation, Bruce Tuckman's Chapter 5. This chapter is called Multi-Factor Risk Metrics and Hedges, and just as a point of reference, in the previously assigned Bruce Tuckman, which was the second edition, and that book really survived for 10 years before Bruce Tuckman updated it, this chapter was previously called Key Rate and Bucket Exposure. And I bring that up because the essence of the chapter is really about the key rate or key rate shift technique, if you will, and we'll see that coming up. The learning spreadsheet that's associated is called T4.Tuckman.5 multi-factor, and that's because, of course, this is a topic 4 in the part 1, which is valuation and risk models. Tuckman's the author. .5 because it's chapter 5 and then multi-factor. Its relevance for the exam continues to be low. I can say that somewhat safely because historically this has been tested somewhat lightly. And that's not to suggest it's a superficial topic at all. It's actually a deep topic that requires some time, in my opinion, to understand this key rate shift technique. So I'll leave that up to you. On the one hand, it's time consuming. On the other hand, it's difficult to test, and it remains to be seen to what extent GARP can probe this reading deeply in the exam. But this learning spreadsheet illustrates, actually mimics the model of the key rate shift technique in some detail. And so the first learning outcome is describe and assess the major weaknesses attributable to single-factor approaches when hedging portfolios or implementing asset liability techniques. So a key phrase here is the single-factor approaches. Now, we tend to use duration under the single-factor approach. And by the way, our use of yield-based duration and also convexity, when we use duration and convexity together, that's not double factor right there. That's single factor because the single factor in our typical usage up to this point is the yield, or yield to maturity is the single factor. That yield gets employed in both the duration and convexity. So that's a common mistake to make, to think that convexity is the second factor. It's not. Duration and convexity that we've been using up until now are both part of the single factor approaches. So really, in terms of part 1, this is the first introduction to something beyond the yield as the single factor that contributes to the approximation based on duration and convexity. However, this approach tends to assume this closely related assumption of parallel shift in the yield curve, or at least a very strong relationship between yields of different maturities. And hopefully you can see how these are necessarily connected. If we take a term structure, for example, at the 30 years, semi-annual, so 60 periods, if we're going to characterize the term structure by a single factor, now we can, in fact, use the single factor to model non-parallel shifts, but in practice, realistically, with the yield assumption, the yield being the single factor implicitly flat, and if we only have that factor, then a shift you can see is almost very natural that it tends to imply a parallel shift in the yield curve. So that's the big limiting assumption, that our single rate factor, where we tend to use yield to maturity as the factor, by shocking that factor, because we're limited to the single factor, we tend to coincidentally assume the parallel shift in the yield curve, but that's not realistic, so it doesn't let us model more realistic shifts or changes or twists in the yield curve.